Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise in support of the motion before the Parliament. Tasmanian Labor joins with members of the Tasmanian, Armenian, Assyrian and Greek communities in honouring the approximately 1.5 million Armenian men, women and children, and more than 1 million Assyrians and Greeks who fell victim to the first genocide of the 20th century. I too would like to recognise the efforts of the member for Bass, Ms Lara Alexander, who has been instrumental in working to make sure the Parliament can have this debate. Thank you for your persistence, because it is important that we take moments like these to reflect on our world history and our shared humanity. I would also like to join with the Premier in welcoming our guests here to the Parliament today for this really important and significant occasion. Mr Speaker, a century ago and halfway across the world, there was a terrible atrocity committed against the Hellenic, Armenian and Assyrian people and other minority Christian groups by the Ottoman government. The genocide that occurred then may seem like a distant memory for many across our Tasmanian community. Sadly, the world has seen an untold number of tragedies and atrocities since that time, including 2 world wars, numerous other global conflicts, and an increasing number of natural disasters around the world. Both the passage of time and the passing of people who lived through such dark times inevitably diminishes the immediate memory of these events. But they must never diminish the horror or historical significance of these events. And we must strive to keep them in our minds and to learn from them as we go forward, to help stamp out such crimes against humanity and to stop them from happening again. Mr Speaker, the systematic deportation and massacre of Greeks, Armenians and Assyrians by the Ottoman government began in 1915 after the Ottoman Empire joined the First World War and continued until 1923. Around 1.5 million Armenian men, women and children and more than 1 million Assyrians and Greeks lost their lives in this, the first genocide of the 20th century. The displacement, starvation, persecution and outright murder of these and other minority Christian groups caused enormous suffering, devastation, wiped out families, fractured others, and left Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks scattered all over the world as they fled the conflict and fought to survive. But to this day, it remains unrecognised, in fact, actively denied by the Turkish government, despite having been well documented and affirmed by legal scholars and historians, and of course, those who've lived and their ancestors. And as we know, for us to learn from our past, we need to first recognise our past. As the ultimate act of a racial, religious and cultural intolerance, the condemnation of genocide has never been more important. This is borne out by the frightening rise of intolerance today throughout the world, despite the lessons history has taught us. And we must keep calling it out and fighting against it, because we know from history that genocide doesn't come out of nowhere. It starts as intolerance, and if intolerance is allowed to flourish and strengthen into hate, it's a short step to becoming something much worse. Mr Speaker, we have tens of thousands of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks in Australia, and many of them would be descended from people affected by these atrocities halfway across the world a century ago. I recognise and I honour the extraordinary humanitarian efforts of the then newly formed Commonwealth of Australia, including Tasmania, for welcoming the orphans and other survivors of the genocide who set a proud tradition of international humanitarian efforts by our state. In the century since, we've seen this welcoming spirit on many occasions, be it for post-World War II refugees or people fleeing unrest across the world from Kosovo to Africa. I would like to speak to the descendants of those who migrated here, seeking a more peaceful and inclusive place to call home after they were driven from theirs. You are valued members of our community. We are proud of the contribution that you make to our multicultural society, to our community and in our lives. We recognise the pain from your past and we condemn the genocide of your ancestors. We recognise the importance of remembering and learning from this and other dark chapters in our global history, and to ensure that such humanitarian atrocities are not repeated. Mr. Speaker, we also acknowledge the 34 United Nations member states that have recognised the genocide of Armenian, Assyrian and Greek communities, and we condemn and oppose all attempts to deny or distort the historical truth of this and other acts of genocide committed in the 20th century. Mr. Speaker, we mourn with Armenian Australian, Assyrian Australian and Greek Australian people for the genocide suffered by their ancestors. We recognise the suffering and the destruction of their people a century ago and the unquestionable impact on generations of survivors and their descendants of the atrocities committed against them. And importantly, Mr. Speaker, we remember them. We remember their place in history, and we recognise the lessons we need to go on learning from the atrocities committed against them. Mr. Speaker, I commend this motion to the House.
Thank you.